At exactly 0900 hours on February 19, 1945, Corporal Tony Stein lay pressed into a shallow depression carved by artillery in the black volcanic sand of Iwo Jima, gripping a weapon that 3 months earlier his own sergeant had laughed at and called the dumbest idea he'd ever seen. And at that moment in history, Stein was only 23 years old, had flown through 6 combat landings, and had never recorded what the military would classify as a conventional confirmed kill. While around him the beach of this tiny 8-square-mile island had been transformed by the Japanese defenders into a living nightmare of overlaps, tunnels, slit trenches, concealed bunkers, camouflaged pillboxes, interlocking machine gun nests, mortars, and artillery positions, totaling more than 11 miles of underground tunnel networks, and roughly 17,000 soldiers prepared to die in place, making the black sand beach less of a landing zone and more of a slaughterhouse designed to trap and destroy any wave of attackers brave or foolish enough to come ashore. And Stein, a member of Company A, 1st Battalion, 28th Marines, 5th Marine Division, was among the first Americans who crawled past the water's edge and found a fragile scrap of cover, while Marines around him were being cut down by machine gun and mortar fire, coming from positions they could not even see because the Japanese had buried and camouflaged everything so well that the battlefield looked empty and quiet until men began falling over dead, and by mid-morning more than 40 Marines were already dead, their bodies twisted into the soft volcanic ash, faces frozen in shock, helmets knocked loose, rifles half buried in sand, while the standard American machine gun, the Browning M1919, strong and reliable, weighed more than 30 pounds without ammunition and fired at only 400 rounds per minute. A weapon designed more for slowing down an enemy than for charging into firestorms, and Stein had realized months earlier that this weapon, though powerful, was never built for the kind of violent, forward-driven assault that island warfare demanded. And his mind had been turning for months because long before this beach existed in his world, he had been a toolmaker from Dayton, Ohio, born to Austrian Jewish immigrants who had escaped rising hatred and destruction in Eastern Europe, and as a boy he had worked metal and machines instead of books, dropped out of school, mastered lathes at Patterson Field, learned how steel behaved under pressure at Delo Products, and by the time he joined the Paramarines in 1942, metal, mechanics, timing, and force were as natural to him as breathing, and when he fought at Bougainville he proved himself not just as a fighter, but as a problem solver, a man who could look at broken equipment and see possibilities instead of limits. And it was there that Sergeant Mel Grevich, a man as dangerous and clever as Stein, began experimenting with something that most officers would have thrown away, a salvaged AN-M2 aircraft machine gun recovered from a crashed Douglas Dauntless dive bomber, a weapon designed for aerial dogfights, incredibly light at roughly 21 pounds, and with a blistering firing rate that could reach as high as 1,200 rounds per minute, 3 times faster than the ground gun, but built useless for infantry because it had no stock, no sights, no grip for a single man to control, and for most men, it was scrap metal. But for Stein, it was potential, and in a maintenance shed in Hawaii in late 1944, while officers slept and men gambled, Stein cut down the butt of an M1 Garand rifle, hollowed it out, welded and shaped metal scraps into a functioning solenoid trigger system, attached a bar bipod for stability, bolted on rear battle sites, and with the help of Grevich and Little, created something ugly, dangerous, unstable, illegal, and devastating, a weapon weighing around 25 pounds that could chew through an entire ammunition box in seconds, and they gave it a nickname that would not exist in official documents, but in whispers only. They called it the Stinger, and when other Marines first saw it, reactions ranged from laughter to fear, with some saying it would melt on its first burst and others saying it would explode in its user's hands. But when Stein test-fired it downrange and shredded a steel target in seconds, no one laughed anymore, and official approval came not because officers liked the weapon, but because they saw what it could do. And so 6 of these monsters went to war, and one of them was in Tony Stein's hands that morning on Iwo Jima, and as he lay in the ash while men died around him, he understood something terrifyingly simple. No tanks could reach him because they were bogged down in the ash. No naval gunfire could help because they couldn't see the hidden guns. And so Stein made a decision that separates legends from names forgotten in sand. He stood up fully, in full view of concealed machine gunners, and let them see him, because he needed them to fire. He needed to see their muzzle flashes. He needed targets, and as bullets snapped past his head and mortars kicked up pillars of black sand around him, he spotted what he needed, a camouflaged pillbox barely 75 yards away, with a Type 92 heavy machine gun barrel barely visible beneath volcanic rock. And Stein raised the stinger and squeezed the trigger, and the world exploded, because the weapon screamed to life, ripping out rounds faster than the human eye could follow, tearing into the sandbags and rock, chewing concrete, shattering confidence, and in 5 seconds the Japanese gun went silent, and Stein did not stop. He shifted left, found another position, fired again, erased it, and in that instant the Marines around him saw something new, a moving wall of sound and fire that made it possible to stand up and move. And while textbooks talk about formations and doctrine, in real war, momentum is everything, and Stein had created it with pure mechanical violence. And when the magazine ran dry, reality hit him hard, because the Stinger was a monster that ate ammunition faster than any weapon he'd ever used, and without food, it was just dead metal. And so he turned and sprinted across open ground toward the beach, because that is where the ammunition was, and every yard between him and the water was controlled by Japanese mortars and snipers, and the volcanic ash under his feet was like running on ball bearings, collapsing, swallowing boots, stealing speed, and halfway through that sprint he saw a wounded Marine screaming and unable to walk, and rather than step over him, Stein lifted him onto his shoulders and kept running, carrying the weight of a grown man, his own weapon, his pack, and the pressure of death from above, and somehow reached the shoreline, dumped the Marine into the hands of a corpsman, grabbed ammunition boxes, and ran back into hell without hesitation. And this cycle repeated again and again, until the beach was no longer just a killing field, but a supply line beaten in two. Submission by one barefoot, determined mind that refused to accept that pinned down meant defeated. And with every run, Stein returned not just with bullets, but with wounded men who would have died if left behind. And as the hours passed, his boots began to fail, the soles torn away by the razor-like volcanic ash. The leather cracked, and doing the math in his head, he realized that boots slowed him down more than they helped, and so he did something that looked insane to everyone. Watching, he kicked them off, removed his helmet to save weight, and began running barefoot through black ash soaked in blood and metal fragments. Because for him, war was not about appearance, it was about efficiency, and bare feet meant more grip, more control, and those feet bled with every step, but they moved faster, and he ignored pain because pain was just information that something hurt, and slowing down would kill more men, and with every trip he made, the Stinger grew hotter, the barrel glowing, the wood charring, the trigger jamming, the feed warping, and still it roared back to life every time he slapped and loaded it, and Japanese snipers began to notice that this single Marine was changing the battlefield, and one of them nearly killed him with a close passing round. But instead of hiding, Stein charged the shooter, sprinted straight at the muzzle line, and erased the sniper's position in a storm of metal, because he understood geometry, angles, and fear better than the man on the other side of that rifle, and by early afternoon he had carried out more wounded men than anyone could count accurately, had wiped out pillboxes that had pinned entire companies, and had fired more rounds than most men fired in full battles. And yet the Stinger, bent, burned, scarred, kept working, and every time it roared, Marines moved, and when it fell silent, men froze in place like statues waiting for death. And by mid-afternoon, Company A had clawed its way hundreds of yards inland because one man refused to stay in cover. As the afternoon dragged across the black volcanic landscape of Iwo Jima, Tony Stein's body had become a machine fueled by urgency rather than rest, and the beach that had once been a killing field slowly transformed into a scarred highway of movement because of the chaos he created with the Stinger. And by this time the weapon in his hands no longer resembled anything that had rolled off a factory line, because the barrel glowed a sick metallic purple, the wooden rifle stock had blackened and cracked from sustained heat, and the faint smell of burning oil and scorched wood hung constantly in the air around him. Yet none of that mattered to Stein, because the numbers in his mind were simple and brutal. Marines were pinned down, ammunition was disappearing, enemy guns were hidden, and so long as he could run and the Stinger could still fire, solutions existed, and as the resistance intensified, Japanese soldiers began emerging from spider holes, trenches, and tunnel exits, firing from multiple angles, creating a shifting maze of death that would have broken the spirit of any ordinary unit. But Stein, moving with a strange mechanical calm, started solving the battlefield like a diagram, identifying arcs of fire, overlapping cones, and blind zones, and whenever he spotted a flash or movement, he reacted without hesitation, lifting the Stinger, squeezing the trigger, and letting the deafening roar of Weaponized desperation dominate the air, and with every violent burst, Marines surged forward in those precious seconds of suppressed fire, dragging the wounded, throwing grenades, clearing holes one by one, and by late morning, Stein had already made more trips to the shoreline than any sane man would count, each time returning with ammunition boxes digging into his shoulders, and wounded Marines bleeding across his back, and somewhere along the way, the nickname started spreading through the ranks, whispered first and then spoken aloud. The Barefoot Corporal, the insane Corporal, the walking machine gun, and even men who had never seen him up close began to understand that something abnormal was happening on this beach, because they could hear it before they saw it. The violent, ripping sound of aircraft fire in ground combat, the sound of hope made into noise, and no matter where the fight was fiercest, there was Stein, running through ash with blood-covered legs and a smoking weapon. And when Japanese snipers began targeting him deliberately, he did not retreat like doctrine would suggest. Instead, he reversed the logic of the battlefield, charging toward the danger rather than away from it, running perpendicular to sniper fire, closing distance until the Stinger's brutal firepower erased the marksman's position. And this behavior shocked both friend and enemy alike, because men are trained to avoid fire, not run toward it. But Stein's mind functioned on a different level. To him, fear was not an emotion. It was a variable, something to be factored and managed rather than obeyed. And as the hours stretched toward midday, the conditions worsened because the Japanese defense network grew denser, pillboxes multiplying, trenches deepening, tunnel openings appearing like mouths that spat out gunfire and then disappeared, and entire companies were halted by single reinforced bunkers that tanks could not reach and bombs could not destroy. And against logic, it was a single Marine with a handmade weapon that solved what heavy equipment could not, because Stein learned the rhythm of these defenses and adapted, repeatedly suppressing firing slits long enough for demolition teams to run forward with satchel charges and grenades, turning what looked like concrete fortresses into smoking tombs. And with every successful assault, his own body degraded further, feet torn apart by volcanic rock, lungs burning from smoke and ash, hands blistered and bleeding from heat, shoulders screaming from constant loads. But he remained functional because he had become fully synchronized with the mechanics of what needed to be done, and war no longer existed as a chaos around him, but as a series of rapid-fire problems to solve. And then came the moment when even his luck began to falter, when a direct hit struck the Stinger hard enough to rip it from his hands and throw it backward into open sand, leaving him unarmed, exposed, and in full view of a machine gun nest eager to finish what it had started. And in that moment, lesser men would have frozen or retreated. But to Stein, the weapon lying in the ash was not just metal, it was the solution to everything around him, and without hesitation, he sprinted into open fire, weaving, zigzagging, counting seconds, and grabbing the broken weapon like a drowning man grabbing air, rolling into shallow cover and repairing the damage with bare hands while bullets snapped overhead, straightening bent rails, clearing twisted belts, forcing broken components to cooperate through pure force of will. And when the Stinger roared back to life, he unleashed it in a furious burst that erased the very position that had disarmed him, turning fear into silence, and silence into movement for the men behind him. And just when exhaustion should have made him collapse, the battlefield demanded more, and he gave it, running again and again toward the shoreline to drag back ammunition and wounded brothers, until men started losing count of how many runs he had made. And even historians would later debate exact numbers because no one watching believed what they were seeing in real time. And by mid-afternoon, Japanese grenades and rifle fire began scoring hits on Stein himself. Small wounds in his legs, shrapnel in his back, blood slowly soaking into his uniform, but he kept moving, fighting, suppressing, destroying, advancing, because every time he considered stopping, he saw another Marine pinned down in the ash, another man who would die if the gunfire didn't stop for just a few seconds. And so he kept giving them those seconds, 5 seconds of fire, 10 seconds of breathing. Room, enough for movement, enough for survival. And when the Stinger finally began to fail mechanically, its barrel bent, its feed jamming, its trigger firing unpredictably, he adapted again by manually cycling the mechanism between bursts, slapping the receiver, coaxing life from a weapon that by all mechanical logic should have been dead. And by late afternoon, Company A had reached its objective for the day, not because of perfect planning, not because of superior numbers, but because one man had refused to let hidden guns control the pace of the battle. And as darkness threatened to swallow the battlefield, Japanese infiltrators began probing the perimeter in small groups, testing American defenses, slipping through shadows, crawling through ash, And even then, the broken, wounded, exhausted Barefoot corporal lifted the battered Stinger and unleashed just enough fire to send death back into the darkness. And by dawn of the following day, Stein had been awake for nearly a full day, had pushed his body beyond safe limits, and yet the battle was only beginning, because in front of them rose Mount Suribachi, the jagged volcanic mountain that dominated the island and allowed enemy observers to see every movement. And as Company A prepared for the climb, Stein's injuries were finally treated in the briefest and most brutal fashion, because there was no real time for healing in hell, only pauses between suffering, and when the order came to move, he lifted the Stinger again, now repaired just enough to function, and followed his unit up the slopes of loose ash, because whatever that mountain held, it would have to learn the same lesson as the beach, that momentum, violence, and refusal to halt could rewrite the mathematics of war, and halfway up the brutal slope, fortified bunkers and concrete mouths opened fire, stalling entire formations, and once again, Stein stepped forward, aimed the damaged weapon, and unleashed covering fire that turned narrow firing slits into useless holes and allowed demolition marines to sprint forward with explosives. And then came the grenade that nearly ended everything, exploding just feet from him, tearing metal into his flesh, ripping into his body, and leaving him bleeding heavily into the ash. And this time, even he could not ignore the loss of blood and strength. And when the corpsman finally forced evacuation, Stein resisted, not because he loved war, but because he loved the men behind him more than he valued his own survival. And only when his vision narrowed and his body betrayed him did he allow himself to be carried down the mountain, believing that perhaps he had finally done his part, that perhaps others could carry the burden from here. And as he was loaded onto the hospital ship, the sound of battle faded, but the war inside him did not, because, even while being stitched together and cleaned of volcanic sand and blood, his mind replayed the faces of men still up there fighting. And this is where most stories of survival would end, but his did not. Because when news reached him that his unit was being destroyed further north, logic failed again, and emotion did what no doctor could. And against orders, against reason, against medical advice, Tony Stein climbed back into a landing craft and returned to the same black beach that had nearly killed him, reclaimed boots, reclaimed a rifle, and began the long, lonely walk north across miles of ruined volcanic terrain, stepping through wreckage, fire-blackened tanks, shattered helmets, and the silent rows of American dead, because someone had to return to that unit. And in his mind, there was no debate about who that someone should be. By the time the fourth enemy aircraft exploded, Major Carroll C. Smith's hands were shaking inside his thick flight gloves. 80 minutes had passed since takeoff, but it felt like 8 hours. The sky above the Philippines was no longer just dark. It was alive with threat. Inside the belly of the P-61 Black Widow, the radar scope pulsed with green blips that meant life or death. His radar operator leaned forward. Tango at 2 o'clock. Range closing fast. Smith didn't rely on sight. He trusted the machine. This was the secret weapon, airborne radar. While enemy pilots searched blindly through the darkness, Smith was hunting with invisible eyes. He eased the throttle. The twin engines growled. The heavy night fighter surged forward. A Japanese bomber drifted into the center of his scope. Distance, 900 yards, 800, 801. The enemy crew had no idea they were being hunted. Smith lined up the shot. Guns. Now. 20mm cannons erupted. The night ripped open. Bright orange tracers smashed through the bomber's fuselage. Fire burst from the wing. The aircraft folded in half. Silence returned to the cockpit, except for heavy breathing. 4 kills confirmed. Mission complete. As they turned back toward base, the radar screen fell quiet. No more blips, no more targets. Just darkness. Below them, Allied bases slept safely. When Smith landed, ground crews counted the gunfire residue and stared in disbelief. 1 pilot. 1 aircraft. 4 kills. Total darkness. The legend of the night hunters was born. Radar had made the sky transparent, and fear now belonged to the darkness.